The rain hammered against the windows of the military recruitment office as Sarah Martinez sat in the waiting room, her worn sneakers tapping nervously against the polished floor. At 19, she looked younger than her years, with shoulder-length dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail and clothes that had seen better days. The other recruits glanced at her with barely concealed amusement, whispering among themselves about the girl who thought she could make it in the army. Sarah had grown up in the rough neighborhoods of East Los Angeles, where gunshots were as common as car horns and survival meant learning to be tough before you learned to read. Her father had disappeared when she was 7, leaving her mother to raise 3 children on a waitress's salary. By the time Sarah turned 16, she was working 2 part-time jobs to help pay rent, her dreams of college fading with each unpaid bill that arrived in the mail. The military recruiter had visited her high school on a gray Tuesday morning, his crisp uniform and confident demeanor cutting through the usual chaos of teenage life like a knife through butter. He spoke of opportunities, of education benefits, of a chance to serve something greater than yourself. But what caught Sarah's attention wasn't the promise of college money or career training. It was the way he carried himself, the respect in people's eyes when they looked at him, the sense of purpose that seemed to radiate from every gesture. That night, Sarah had gone home to their cramped apartment and found her mother sitting at the kitchen table, staring at a pile of bills with tears in her eyes. The electricity had been shut off again, and her youngest brother Miguel was doing homework by candlelight. Sarah made her decision right then, watching her family struggle in the flickering shadows. Now, 3 months later, she sat in the recruitment office surrounded by young men who looked like they had stepped out of action movies. They were tall, broad-shouldered, confident in the way that came from never having to wonder where your next meal was coming from. Their workout clothes bore the logos of expensive gyms, and their conversations revolved around protein supplements and training regimens that cost more than Sarah's family spent on groceries in a month. Next, called the sergeant behind the desk, and Sarah's heart jumped. She stood on shaky legs, smoothing down her thrift store blouse as she approached the window. The sergeant, a weathered man in his 40s with kind eyes and graying hair, smiled at her warmly. "Sarah Martinez," she said, sliding her paperwork across the counter. The sergeant reviewed her documents with practiced efficiency, nodding as he checked off boxes and stamped forms. Everything seemed routine until he reached the section marked "Requested Military Occupational Specialty." His eyebrows shot up as he read her selection. "Miss Martinez," he said slowly, looking up at her with surprise. "You've marked down that you want to be a sniper. Are you sure about this? There are many other positions that might be more suitable for someone with your, background." The conversation wasn't quiet, and several of the other recruits turned to listen. Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks as snickers rippled through the waiting room. She heard someone whisper, "A sniper? She probably can't even hold a rifle steady." Sarah lifted her chin, meeting the sergeant's gaze directly. "Yes, sir. I'm sure." The sergeant leaned back in his chair, studying her with new interest. "Miss Martinez, sniper training is one of the most demanding programs in the military. The physical requirements alone eliminate most candidates, and the mental pressure is unlike anything you've ever experienced. Have you ever fired a weapon before?" "No, sir," Sarah admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. The laughter from behind her grew louder. "Then, why," the sergeant asked gently, "do you think you want to pursue this path?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, thinking about how to put into words something she barely understood herself. Ever since she was a child, she had possessed an unusual ability to focus, to block out distractions and zero in on whatever task was in front of her. While other kids fidgeted through classes, Sarah could sit motionless for hours, completely absorbed in a book or a puzzle. Her teachers had called it concentration, but Sarah knew it was something deeper, something that felt almost supernatural in its intensity. "I'm good at being still," she said finally. "I'm good at waiting, and watching, and focusing on small details. I think I could learn to shoot." The sergeant's expression softened. "Miss Martinez, I respect your determination, but sniper training isn't just about being patient. These men," he gestured toward the other recruits, "they've been preparing for military service their whole lives. They've played sports, lifted weights, learned discipline through years of training. What makes you think you can compete with that level of preparation?" Sarah felt something fierce kindle in her chest. She thought about all the nights she had worked double shifts at the diner while her classmates went to parties. She thought about taking care of her younger brothers when her mother worked late, helping them with homework she barely understood herself. She thought about the constant worry about money, about food, about whether they would have a place to live next month. Because I've been training my whole life, she said, her voice growing stronger. Just not in a gym. The sergeant stared at her for a long moment, then reached for a different form. All right, Miss Martinez. I'll put you down for sniper training. But I want you to understand something. The dropout rate for this program is over 80%. Most of the people who don't make it are men who seemed much more qualified than you do right now. I understand, sir. Do you? Because if you wash out, you'll be reassigned to whatever position the army needs to fill. You might end up cooking meals or cleaning latrines for 4 years. Is that really what you want? Sarah nodded firmly. I'll take that risk, sir. The sergeant shook his head but completed the paperwork. As Sarah turned to leave, she caught fragments of conversation from the other recruits. Delusional, one of them was saying. She'll be gone in the first week. Another voice added, I almost feel sorry for her. Walking out into the rain, Sarah pulled her thin jacket tighter around her shoulders. The doubt that had been gnawing at her since she made the decision suddenly felt overwhelming. Maybe they were right. Maybe she was being foolish, chasing after something completely beyond her reach. But, as she walked to the bus stop, she remembered something her grandmother had told her years ago, back when the old woman was still alive. They had been sitting on the front steps of their apartment building, watching the neighborhood kids play basketball in the street. Sarah had been maybe 10 years old, small for her age and quiet in a way that made the other children overlook her. Mija, her grandmother had said in Spanish, her weathered hand stroking Sarah's hair. Sometimes the quietest water runs the deepest. People see only the surface, but they don't know what strength lies beneath. Sarah had asked what that meant, and her grandmother had smiled. It means that power doesn't always announce itself with noise. Sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one nobody notices. Now, standing in the rain waiting for a bus that would take her back to a neighborhood where dreams went to die, Sarah clung to those words like a lifeline. She didn't look like a soldier, didn't sound like one, didn't carry herself with the confidence that seemed to come naturally to the other recruits. But maybe that was exactly what would make her different. The bus arrived 20 minutes late, its brakes squealing as it pulled to a stop. Sarah climbed aboard and found a seat near the back, pressing her forehead against the cool window as the city rolled past. Neon signs reflected off the wet pavement, and she watched people hurrying through the rain with their heads down, each lost in their own struggles. She thought about the sergeant's words, about the 80% dropout rate and the possibility of spending 4 years assigned to kitchen duty. The practical part of her mind whispered that she should call tomorrow and change her specialty to something more realistic. Communications, maybe, or administration. Something safe. But Sarah had spent her entire life choosing the safe option, the practical option, the one that made sense to everyone else. She had watched her dreams get smaller and smaller with each compromise, each time she chose survival over ambition. This was her chance to bet on herself, to reach for something that might lift not just her but her entire family out of the cycle they had been trapped in for generations. The bus pulled to a stop near her neighborhood, and Sarah gathered her courage along with her belongings. Tomorrow, she would report for processing, and, in a few weeks, she would ship out to basic training. After that, if she survived the initial crucible, would come the real test, sniper school. As she walked the last few blocks home, Sarah made herself a promise. She would not be one of the 80% who gave up. Whatever it took, however hard she had to work, however much she had to endure, she would find a way to succeed. The girl they had laughed at today would become someone they would remember for very different reasons. She didn't know yet about the symbol that would one day make a general whisper in recognition. She didn't know about the legend she would become or the missions that would define her career. All she knew was that somewhere inside her quiet exterior burned something unbreakable, something that had been forged by years of struggle and hardship. That night, Sarah lay in her narrow bed listening to the sounds of the city outside her window. Sirens wailed in the distance, and somewhere nearby a dog was barking. Her brothers slept peacefully in the bed across the room, and she could hear her mother moving quietly in the kitchen, probably trying to make their meager groceries stretch another few days. This was what she was fighting for, Sarah realized. Not just her own future, but the chance to give her family something better. The chance to prove that where you came from didn't have to determine where you were going. The chance to show everyone who had ever underestimated her that they had been looking at the surface when they should have been paying attention to what lay beneath. She closed her eyes and began to dream of targets that seemed impossibly far away, of steady hands and quiet breathing, of becoming something more than anyone had ever imagined possible. In her dreams, she was already the soldier she would one day become, patient and precise and absolutely lethal. The transformation had begun, though Sarah didn't know it yet. The girl who would one day earn the whispered name Black Talon was taking her first steps toward a destiny that would surprise everyone, including herself. And, somewhere in the darkness of that cramped apartment, something dangerous was being born. The alarm at Fort Benning rang at 0430 hours every morning, but Sarah Martinez had been awake for 20 minutes already. While her fellow recruits groaned and stumbled from their bunks, she was already dressed and making her bed with crisp, hospital corners that would pass even the most demanding inspection. Basic training had been a shock to her system, but not in the way everyone expected. The physical demands were brutal, the verbal abuse constant, and the sleep deprivation designed to break down even the strongest personalities. But Sarah discovered something surprising about herself during those first grueling weeks. She thrived under pressure in ways that baffled both her drill sergeants and her fellow recruits. Where others cracked under the relentless stress, Sarah seemed to grow calmer. When Drill Sergeant Morrison screamed in her face about her pathetic excuse for a push-up, she simply nodded and did better ones. When forced marches left bigger, stronger recruits whimpering about blisters and exhaustion, Sarah kept her mouth shut and her feet moving, one step at a time. It wasn't that she felt no pain or fear. Every muscle in her body ached, and the constant uncertainty about whether she would make it through another day gnawed at her constantly. But Sarah had learned something during her childhood that many of her fellow recruits had never been forced to master: how to endure without breaking. The first time she touched a rifle, something clicked into place inside her mind. The M16 felt heavy and awkward in her hands initially, but there was something about the precise mechanics of it, the way every component had a purpose and a place, that spoke to the part of her that had always found order in chaos. During their first day on the shooting range, the other recruits clustered together, comparing their targets and boasting about their groupings. Sarah hung back, studying her paper target with the same intensity she had once brought to helping her brothers with their homework. Her shots were scattered across the target, barely acceptable by military standards, but she could see a pattern in the misses that others couldn't. Martinez, Drill Sergeant Morrison barked, appearing beside her with that supernatural ability all drill sergeants seem to possess. "What's your excuse for this pathetic display?" Sarah looked up at him, considering her words carefully. "Sergeant, I think I'm pulling to the left because I'm anticipating the recoil. And my breathing isn't steady. I need to work on my follow-through." Morrison stared at her, surprised by the analytical response. Most recruits would have made excuses or blamed the equipment. "And how do you plan to fix these problems, Martinez?" "Practice, Sergeant. And patience." Over the following weeks, Sarah spent every free moment she could at the range, often arriving early or staying late when permitted. She watched the best shooters obsessively, noting how they held their bodies, how they breathed, how they squeezed the trigger. She studied ballistics manuals in the library and memorized windage tables until she could recite them in her sleep. The improvement wasn't immediate, but it was steady and undeniable. Her groupings grew tighter, her scores climbed, and, most importantly, her understanding of the rifle and its capabilities deepened with each round fired. Other recruits began to notice, but their admiration was mixed with something else: unease. There was something unsettling about the way Sarah approached marksmanship. While others celebrated good shots with whoops and high fives, Sarah simply recorded her scores in a small notebook and analyzed what had gone right or wrong. She treated each shot like a puzzle to be solved rather than a test to be passed. Private Jackson, a former college football player from Alabama who had initially been among those who laughed at Sarah's sniper aspirations, found himself both impressed and disturbed by her progress. "It's like she turns into a different person when she picks up that rifle," he confided to another recruit. "All quiet and focused, like she's not even there anymore." The observation was more accurate than Jackson realized. When Sarah entered her shooting stance, something fundamental shifted in her consciousness. The noise of the range faded to nothing, her heartbeat slowed, and her entire world narrowed to the relationship between herself, the rifle, and the target. It was a state of absolute focus that felt more natural to her than normal consciousness. As basic training progressed, Sarah's scores continued to improve while her personality seemed to become even more reserved. She spoke only when spoken to, volunteered for extra duties without complaint, and maintained a level of self-discipline that impressed even the most demanding instructors. But there were moments when her fellow recruits caught glimpses of something else beneath the quiet exterior. During a particularly brutal training exercise in the Georgia heat, several recruits collapsed from exhaustion and dehydration. Sarah, despite being smaller and seemingly less prepared than most of them, kept going long after others had given up. When asked later how she had managed it, she simply said, "I've been hot and tired before." This was just Tuesday. The comment revealed something her fellow recruits were beginning to understand. Sarah's version of normal had prepared her for hardships they couldn't imagine. Where they saw impossible challenges, she saw familiar territory. But it was during a night training exercise that Sarah first demonstrated the quality that would eventually earn her the whispered name that would make generals pause in recognition. The exercise was designed to test stealth and observation skills, with recruits required to move through a wooded area without being detected by instructors armed with night vision equipment. Most of the recruits approached it like a game, using tactics they had learned from movies or video games. They moved in short sprints from tree to tree, tried to stay low, and inevitably got caught by the patient instructors who had been running this exercise for years. Sarah took a different approach entirely. She studied the terrain during daylight, noting the patterns of shadow and light, the places where natural cover would provide the best concealment. When night fell, she moved with a patience that was almost supernatural, sometimes remaining motionless for 20 or 30 minutes at a time before taking her next step. The instructors, accustomed to catching recruits within the first hour, found themselves baffled as Sarah simply vanished into the landscape. She moved like smoke through the trees, using the natural sounds of the forest to mask any noise she made. By the time the exercise ended at dawn, she was the only recruit who had successfully reached the objective without being detected. Drill Sergeant Morrison found her sitting calmly by the target marker, having arrived there over an hour earlier. "How long have you been here, Martinez?" "About 67 minutes, Sergeant." "And you've been sitting here the whole time? Why didn't you signal that you had reached the objective?" Sarah looked up at him with an expression that was almost serene. "The exercise parameters said to reach the objective without being detected, Sergeant. They didn't say to announce my arrival. I figured staying hidden was still part of the mission." It was a response that revealed something important about how Sarah's mind worked. While others focused on completing tasks, she focused on excelling at them. While others sought approval, she sought perfection. Word of the night exercise spread quickly through the training company, and Sarah found herself the subject of whispered conversations among recruits and instructors alike. Some were impressed, others were unsettled, and a few were beginning to suspect that they had seriously underestimated the quiet girl from East Los Angeles. As basic training entered its final weeks, Sarah's reputation as a marksman had become undeniable. Her rifle scores were consistently in the top 5% of all recruits, and her field performance was even more impressive. But what struck instructors most was not just her skill, but her attitude toward that skill. Unlike other exceptional shooters who displayed their abilities with obvious pride, Sarah seemed almost detached from her achievements. She accepted praise with a simple thank you and moved on, as if accuracy with a rifle was simply something she did rather than something she had accomplished. This attitude extended to all aspects of her training. She mastered map reading, radio protocols, and field medicine with the same methodical patience she brought to marksmanship. She helped struggling recruits without being asked and never complained about additional duties or harsh treatment from instructors. But, perhaps most notably, she never talked about her plans for sniper training. While other recruits with advanced military specialties constantly discussed their upcoming schools and assignments, Sarah remained silent about her intentions. When directly asked about it, she would simply say, "We'll see what happens." This reticence wasn't modesty or uncertainty. Sarah had spent too many years watching people's dreams get crushed by circumstances beyond their control to count on anything before it actually happened. She had learned to keep her hopes private and her expectations realistic, even as she worked relentlessly toward her goals. The graduation ceremony from basic training was held on a crisp October morning, with families gathered to watch their sons and daughters receive their first military achievement. Sarah's mother and brothers had made the trip from Los Angeles, her mother looking proud and worried in equal measure as she watched her daughter march in formation with the other new soldiers. After the ceremony, as families mingled and celebrated, Sarah found herself approached by Drill Sergeant Morrison. He had been observing her for months now, and something about her performance had convinced him to take an unusual step. "Martinez," he said quietly, pulling her aside from the celebration. "I've been training recruits for 15 years, and I want you to know something. What you've accomplished here isn't normal. The way you think, the way you approach challenges, the way you handle stress, it's different from anything I've seen." Sarah waited for him to continue, her expression neutral. "You're going to sniper school next month," Morrison continued. "And I want you to understand something about that place. It's designed to break people who think they're special. They'll try to get inside your head, make you doubt everything you think you know about yourself." "Yes, Sergeant. But here's what they don't know," Morrison said, his voice dropping even lower. "You've already been broken. And you put yourself back together stronger than before. That gives you something most people going into that program don't have." "What's that, Sergeant?" Morrison studied her face for a moment, seeing something in her eyes that reminded him of the most dangerous soldiers he had known during his own deployments overseas. "You've got nothing left to lose, Martinez. And that makes you more dangerous than any of those boys who think they're going to war to become heroes." He paused, then added something that would stick with Sarah for the rest of her career. "Heroes die, Martinez. But survivors complete the mission." That night, as Sarah lay in her bunk for the last time at Fort Benning, she thought about Morrison's words. Tomorrow, she would head home for a brief leave before reporting to sniper school. In 3 weeks, she would begin the most difficult training program the military had to offer, competing against hand-picked soldiers who had been preparing for this opportunity their entire adult lives. The girl who had been laughed at in the recruitment office had survived basic training and proven herself capable of excellence under pressure. But the real test was still ahead. Sniper school would push her beyond anything she had experienced so far, testing not just her shooting ability but her mental toughness, her ability to think clearly under extreme stress, and her capacity to make life-and-death decisions with perfect accuracy. As she drifted off to sleep, Sarah allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. She had made it this far through sheer determination and an unshakable belief that she was capable of more than anyone imagined. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, she could rest in the knowledge that she was no longer the uncertain girl who had walked into that recruitment office months ago. She was becoming something else entirely, something that would soon earn her a reputation that would spread far beyond the walls of any training facility. The transformation was accelerating, and soon the world would discover what happened when you took someone who had nothing to lose and gave them the deadliest skills the military could teach. The United States Army Sniper School at Fort Moore was a place where legends were born and reputations died. As Sarah Martinez stepped off the transport vehicle that brought her to the sprawling training facility, she was struck by how ordinary everything looked. Low concrete buildings, manicured lawns, and training areas that could have belonged to any military base in the country. What she couldn't see was the weight of history that hung over every square inch of the place. This was where the military's most elite marksmen had learned their craft, where men who would later become legends had been pushed to their absolute limits and beyond. The dropout rate here was even higher than basic training, and the standards were so demanding that even experienced soldiers often found themselves broken and sent home. Sarah was one of 43 soldiers selected for this particular class, and as she looked around at her fellow candidates, the familiar feeling of being an outsider settled over her shoulders like an old coat. These weren't fresh-faced recruits like the ones she had trained with at Fort Benning. These were seasoned soldiers, many with combat experience, all of whom had demonstrated exceptional marksmanship abilities during their previous assignments. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, the lead instructor, was a compact man in his 30s whose every movement spoke of lethal efficiency. His introduction to the class was brief and, to the point: "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to hell. Over the next 8 weeks, we will determine which of you have what it takes to become a United States Army sniper. Most of you do not. Most of you will be gone within the first 2 weeks. This is not a failure on your part. It is simply the nature of what we do here." He paused, letting his eyes sweep across the assembled soldiers. When his gaze found Sarah, she felt as though he was looking directly into her soul. "What we teach here is not just marksmanship. Any decent soldier can learn to shoot accurately at known distances under controlled conditions. What we teach here is the ability to kill another human being from a distance so great that they never see it coming, under conditions so stressful that most people would be unable to tie their shoes, let alone make a precise shot." The first week was designed to establish baselines and weed out anyone who had been sent to the school by mistake. The physical requirements were punishing, with daily runs, calisthenics, and obstacle courses that left even the strongest soldiers gasping for breath. The academic portion covered ballistics, weather effects, range estimation, and a dozen other technical subjects that required absolute mastery. But it was the shooting that separated the merely good from the potentially great. The instructors started them at 300 yards, using targets that seemed impossibly small through the scope. Sarah's first few days were humbling. Her shots were accurate enough to pass the minimum standards, but they were nothing special compared to some of her classmates who were consistently hitting bullseyes. Sergeant First Class Williams, a grizzled veteran who served as one of the primary marksmanship instructors, pulled Sarah aside after her third day on the range. "Martinez, I've reviewed your scores from basic training, and I've watched you shoot here. You've got the fundamentals down, but you're thinking too much. You're trying to calculate your way to the perfect shot instead of trusting your instincts." Sarah nodded, taking the criticism without defensiveness. "How do I fix that, Sergeant?" Williams studied her for a moment. "Most people, I tell them to relax and trust their training. But you're different. You need to stop thinking like a mathematician and start thinking like a predator." The comment puzzled Sarah until the next day, when Williams changed her training routine. Instead of shooting at static targets, he had her practice on moving targets, pop-up silhouettes that appeared and disappeared at random intervals. "You have 3 seconds to acquire, aim, and fire," he told her. Think too long, and the opportunity is gone. At first, Sarah missed more than she hit. The pressure to shoot quickly disrupted her careful, methodical approach to marksmanship. But, gradually, something began to shift in her mental process. Instead of consciously calculating windage and elevation, she began to feel the shot, to trust the accumulated hours of training to guide her hands and eyes. The breakthrough came during the 4th week of training, during an exercise that had already eliminated 12 members of their original class. The students were taken to a remote part of the base and, given a scenario, enemy forces were entrenched in a building complex 800 yards away, and their job was to provide overwatch for a simulated rescue operation. The shooting positions were far from ideal, requiring them to fire from uncomfortable angles while dealing with shifting wind conditions and the pressure of time constraints. Sarah found herself assigned to a position behind a fallen log, shooting across a small valley at targets that were barely visible even through her scope. As she settled into her position, something clicked into place in her mind. The noise and activity around her faded away, her breathing slowed to an almost meditative rhythm, and her entire world contracted to the view through her scope. She wasn't thinking about ballistics tables or wind charts anymore. She was simply seeing the target, feeling the rifle, understanding the shot on a level that went beyond conscious thought. Her first shot took down a silhouette target at 820 yards, a clean hit to the center mass. Her second shot, fired 30 seconds later, hit another target at an even greater distance. By the end of the exercise, she had eliminated 7 targets without a single miss, performing better than students who had been consistently outscoring her on previous range exercises. Williams found her after the exercise, his expression unreadable.
Martinez, what happened out there? That shooting was completely different from anything you've shown me before. Sarah considered the question seriously.
I stopped trying to make the perfect shot, Sergeant. I started making the shot that needed to be made. It was a subtle distinction, but Williams understood immediately what she meant. The difference between mechanical accuracy and combat effectiveness, between shooting at targets and eliminating threats. Sarah had crossed a line that some soldiers never managed to cross, even after years of training. From that day forward, Sarah's performance improved dramatically. Her scores climbed steadily, but, more importantly, her approach to shooting became increasingly sophisticated. She began to understand not just the technical aspects of long-range marksmanship, but the psychological and tactical elements that separated true snipers from mere marksmen.
The stalking exercises were particularly revealing.
These complex scenarios required students to move undetected across open terrain, establish shooting positions, engage targets, and then disappear again without being spotted by instructors who were actively hunting them. Many of the strongest shooters struggled with these exercises, unable to adapt their skills to the demands of fieldcraft and concealment. Sarah, however, seemed to have been born for this type of work. Her small size, which had once seemed like a disadvantage, allowed her to hide in places where larger soldiers couldn't fit. Her natural patience served her well during the long periods of motionless observation that were required. And her ability to think several steps ahead helped her plan routes and positions that maximized her chances of success. During one particularly challenging stalking exercise, Sarah spent 6 hours moving less than 400 yards across relatively open ground, using every fold in the terrain, every bush and shadow, to mask her movement. When she finally reached her assigned shooting position, she discovered that she had an almost perfect view of the target area while remaining completely invisible to the instructors who were searching for her. She made her shot, eliminated her target, and then disappeared back into the landscape so effectively that the instructors spent another 2 hours trying to figure out where the shot had come from. When they finally located her, she was already back at the rally point, calmly cleaning her rifle and waiting for the exercise to end. But it wasn't just her technical skills that impressed the instructors. There was something about Sarah's mental approach to the training that set her apart from her classmates. Where others seemed to view each exercise as a test to be passed, Sarah treated every scenario as a real-world situation with life-or-death consequences. This mindset became evident during the psychological pressure testing that formed a crucial part of the curriculum. Students were subjected to sleep deprivation, extreme physical stress, and scenarios designed to test their decision-making abilities under pressure. Many of them cracked under the strain, making critical errors that would have been fatal in actual combat situations. Sarah, however, seemed to thrive under pressure. The more stressful the scenario became, the calmer and more focused she appeared. Instructors who tried to rattle her with verbal abuse or impossible time constraints found themselves dealing with someone who simply absorbed the pressure and continued with her mission. Master Sergeant Thompson, the senior instructor who oversaw the final weeks of training, found himself increasingly intrigued by Sarah's performance. He had trained hundreds of snipers over his career, and he recognized something unusual in her approach to the work. "Martinez," he said one day after a particularly demanding exercise, "I want you to tell me something. When you're behind that scope, looking at a target, what goes through your mind?" Sarah considered the question carefully before answering. "Nothing, Sergeant. Everything else just goes away. It's just me, the rifle, and the target. Everything else is noise." Thompson nodded, understanding what she was describing. It was a mental state that the best snipers achieved, a form of absolute focus that allowed them to perform under conditions that would paralyze most people. But what struck him about Sarah was how naturally this state came to her, how easily she could access it even under extreme stress. As the training program entered its final weeks, the class had been reduced to 18 students. The exercises became increasingly complex, incorporating elements of real-world missions that tested every skill they had learned. Students were required to work in teams, plan and execute mock operations, and demonstrate their ability to perform under conditions that closely mimicked actual combat. It was during one of these final exercises that Sarah first demonstrated the quality that would eventually earn her the designation that would make generals whisper in recognition. The scenario involved a hostage rescue operation, with students assigned to provide overwatch while a simulated assault team moved to secure the objective. Sarah had been assigned to a hide position nearly 1,000 yards from the target building, tasked with eliminating any threats that appeared in specific windows or doorways. The exercise was designed to test her ability to make precise shots under extreme time pressure while coordinating with other elements of the operation.
As the scenario unfolded, everything went wrong.
The assault team encountered unexpected resistance, the timeline accelerated dramatically, and multiple threats appeared simultaneously in different locations. Other students began to show signs of stress, missing shots, or hesitating at critical moments. Sarah, however, seemed to enter an almost supernatural state of calm efficiency. Her shots were not just accurate but perfectly timed, eliminating threats with a precision that allowed the assault team to advance without taking casualties. She adapted to changing conditions instantly, shifting between targets with a speed that bordered on the impossible. When the exercise ended, the observing instructors found themselves looking at shooting results that exceeded anything they had seen in years of running these scenarios. Sarah had engaged 11 separate targets over a 15-minute period, hitting every single one despite constantly changing conditions and extreme time pressure. Master Sergeant Thompson found her after the exercise, his expression a mixture of admiration and something that might have been concern.
"Martinez, that was the finest shooting I've ever seen from a student in this program. But I need to ask you something, and I want an honest answer. When you were taking those shots, what were you feeling?" Sarah met his gaze directly. "Nothing, Sergeant. I wasn't feeling anything at all. I was just doing what needed to be done." It was an answer that revealed something important about what Sarah had become during her time at sniper school. The shy girl from East Los Angeles had been transformed into something else entirely, something that could kill with mechanical precision and emotional detachment. She had learned to access a mental state that most people couldn't imagine, where taking another person's life became simply another technical problem to be solved. The final graduation exercise was held on a cold morning in late autumn, with families and military officials gathered to witness the ceremony. Of the 43 soldiers who had begun the program, only 16 were graduating. Sarah was not only among them but was graduating at the top of her class, with the highest overall scores in the program's recent history. As she stood in formation with her fellow graduates, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. Less than a year ago, she had been a waitress's daughter from a neighborhood where dreams went to die. Now she wore the crossed rifles insignia of a qualified Army sniper, one of the most elite and feared military specialists in the world. But, perhaps more importantly, she had discovered something about herself that she hadn't known existed. Beneath the quiet exterior and modest demeanor lay something that was genuinely dangerous, a capacity for controlled violence that even seasoned military instructors found remarkable. After the ceremony, as she prepared to ship out to her first assignment, Sarah received orders that surprised everyone, including herself. Instead of being assigned to a standard infantry unit as most new snipers were, she was being sent to join a special operations unit whose missions were classified at the highest levels. The orders came with a notation that made Master Sergeant Thompson raise his eyebrows when he reviewed her file, recommended for advanced specialized training. Priority assignment due to exceptional demonstrated capabilities. As Sarah packed her gear that night, she had no way of knowing that her reputation was already beginning to spread through certain circles of the military community. The instructors at sniper school had been quietly discussing her performance, and word was filtering up to commanders who specialized in the kind of missions where exceptional marksmen made the difference between success and catastrophe. She also didn't know that she would soon encounter situations that would test everything she had learned and push her abilities far beyond anything she had experienced in training. The girl who had been laughed at for her ambitious dreams was about to become someone whose very name would be spoken in whispers among those who knew what real danger looked like. The transformation was nearly complete. Soon, Sarah Martinez would become something more than just another Army sniper. She would become the Black Talon, and, when that day came, even generals would pause in recognition of what she had become. The classified briefing room at Fort Bragg was windowless and sterile, with maps and satellite images covering every available wall surface.
Sarah Martinez, now Sergeant Martinez after 18 months of distinguished service, sat at a metal table reviewing mission files that carried security classifications she had only recently earned the right to see. Her first deployment had been to Afghanistan, where she had served with distinction as part of a special operations unit conducting high-priority missions in the most dangerous regions of the country. Over 12 months of combat operations, she had accumulated a record that was already becoming legendary among those who knew about such things: 47 confirmed kills, 0 missed shots under combat conditions, and a reputation for completing missions that others deemed impossible. But it was more than just her shooting that had earned her the attention of military leadership. Sarah had developed an almost supernatural ability to disappear into hostile territory, observe enemy positions for days at a time, and eliminate high-value targets with a precision that bordered on the mythical. Her mission reports were studied by tacticians and psychologists alike, trying to understand how someone could operate with such clinical efficiency in situations that reduced most soldiers to terrified confusion. The mission that would earn her the designation Black Talon began with a briefing from Colonel Harrison, a career special operations officer whose lined face spoke of too many years in dangerous places. He studied Sarah with the calculating gaze of someone who had seen too much violence to be impressed by anything less than the truly extraordinary. "Sergeant Martinez," he began, sliding a photograph across the table toward her. "What you're about to hear does not leave this room. We have a situation in Syria that requires a very specific set of skills, and, according to everyone who's worked with you, you may be the only person capable of handling it." The photograph showed a compound in the middle of what appeared to be a war-torn city, with buildings reduced to rubble extending in every direction. Sarah studied the image with the methodical attention she brought to every aspect of her work, noting sightlines, potential shooting positions, and escape routes. "The target is Hassan al-Rashid," Harrison continued, producing another photograph. "He's a high-level organizer for a terrorist network that's been responsible for attacks across Europe and is planning something catastrophic for American soil. Our intelligence indicates that he's holed up in this compound with approximately 30 armed guards." Sarah examined the second photograph, memorizing the target's face with the same precision she brought to range calculations. "What makes this mission special, sir?" "It seems like a fairly straightforward elimination." Harrison's expression grew grim. "The compound is located in the middle of a civilian area, surrounded by apartment buildings full of families. The nearest possible shooting position is 800 meters away, across terrain that's been turned into a maze of rubble and debris. And the target only appears in public for approximately 30 seconds each day, at an irregular time, in a window that provides less than a 2-foot aperture for the shot." He paused, letting the implications sink in. "We've had surveillance on the location for 6 weeks. 3 different sniper teams have attempted this mission. All of them concluded that the shot is impossible under these conditions." Sarah continued studying the materials, her mind automatically calculating angles, wind patterns, and probability factors. "What's the timeline, sir?" "Al-Rashid is planning to leave the compound in 72 hours. After that, our intelligence suggests he'll disappear into a network of safe houses where we'll never find him again. This is our only shot, literally and figuratively." Harrison leaned back in his chair, watching Sarah's reaction. "I need to be clear about something, Sergeant. This mission is entirely voluntary. The conditions are so dangerous that no one would think less of you for declining. The previous teams included some of the most experienced snipers in the military, and they all recommended that we find another approach." Sarah looked up from the photographs, her expression calm and focused. "What other approach, sir?" "Airstrikes. Level the entire compound and accept the civilian casualties as collateral damage." For the first time since entering the briefing room, Sarah's expression changed slightly. She had seen enough of war to understand that civilian casualties were sometimes unavoidable, but the idea of killing innocent people when there might be another option ran counter to everything she believed about what she did. "I'll need detailed maps of the area," she said quietly. "Weather reports for the past month, intelligence on the target's schedule, and access to satellite imagery from multiple angles." Harrison nodded, having expected this response. "You'll have everything you need. But I want you to understand something, Sergeant. If you miss this shot, Al-Rashid will know we're onto him, and he'll disappear forever.
There won't be a second chance. I understand, sir.
And if you're detected before you can take the shot, you'll be on your own in hostile territory with no backup and no extraction plan. The mission is too sensitive to risk a rescue operation.
Sarah met his gaze directly. I understand that too, sir.
Harrison studied her for a long moment, seeing something in her eyes that reminded him of the most dangerous operators he had known during his career. There was no bravado, no false confidence, just a quiet certainty that was somehow more unsettling than any amount of aggression would have been. There's one more thing, Harrison said, producing a final photograph.
The building you'll be shooting from has this symbol painted on the sidewall.
The image showed a black bird in flight, its wings spread wide and talons extended.
Local intelligence indicates it's some kind of territorial marker used by one of the militia groups operating in the area.
Sarah examined the symbol, committing it to memory along with all the other details of the mission. She had no way of knowing that this same symbol would later become associated with her own reputation, or that years later, military personnel would whisper the name Black Talon when discussing the most dangerous sniper in American military history. The infiltration took 3 days, moving through enemy territory in short stages and taking shelter in ruined buildings during daylight hours. Sarah traveled alone, carrying only her rifle, basic equipment, and enough food and water for a week. Her route took her through streets that had been reduced to rubble by years of warfare, past burned-out vehicles and buildings that stood like broken teeth against the sky. She moved with the same supernatural patience that had characterized her training, sometimes remaining motionless for hours at a time when enemy patrols moved through the area. Her ability to simply disappear into the landscape was so complete that several times she found herself within arm's reach of enemy soldiers who never suspected her presence. On the morning of the 3rd day, she reached the building that would serve as her shooting position. The structure had once been an office building but was now a hollow shell with most of its windows blown out and entire floors collapsed. Sarah made her way to the 4th floor, where she established her hide in a corner room that provided the best angle to the target compound. From her position, the compound looked impossibly far away, a small cluster of buildings wavering in the heat distortion that rose from the rubble-strewn streets. Through her scope, she could see guards moving on the rooftops and occasional figures passing by windows, but the specific window where Al-Rashid was supposed to appear remained stubbornly empty. Sarah settled into wait, knowing that she might have to remain in position for days before her target presented himself. She had learned to enter a state of relaxed alertness that allowed her to maintain focus for extended periods while conserving her energy. Her breathing slowed, her heartbeat steadied, and her entire world contracted to the view through her scope. Hours passed. The sun moved across the sky, changing the shadows and forcing her to make subtle adjustments to her position. Enemy patrols moved through the streets below, unaware of the predator watching from above. Sarah tracked their movements with professional interest, noting their routes and timing, but never losing focus on her primary mission. It was on the 2nd day of her vigil that Al-Rashid finally appeared. The sighting lasted less than 5 seconds, just long enough for her to confirm his identity and note the exact location of the window. He appeared again that evening for an even shorter time, establishing a pattern that gave her hope. On the morning of the 3rd day, as the sun climbed high enough to burn off the early morning shadows, Sarah made her final preparations. She checked her equipment one last time, confirmed her range calculations, and settled into the shooting position she had been practicing for hours. At 10:47 local time, Hassan al-Rashid stepped into view in the compound window, a small figure visible for just a moment against the dark interior of the building. The distance was 847 meters, the crosswind was gusting at approximately 8 miles per hour from the southwest, and the target exposure would last less than 30 seconds. Sarah's breathing slowed to almost nothing, her finger found the trigger, and her entire world contracted to the precise point where her crosshairs intersected with the target. She felt the familiar sensation of absolute focus, where time seemed to slow and every detail became crystal clear. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, the sound of the shot echoing across the ruined cityscape. Through her scope, she watched Al-Rashid collapse, the impact of the bullet ending one of the most dangerous terrorist careers in the modern world. But, instead of immediately beginning her extraction, Sarah remained in position, watching the compound through her scope. Within minutes, armed men poured out of the buildings, searching frantically for the source of the shot. Their confusion was evident even from nearly a kilometer away, as they looked in every direction except the one where she was actually located. It was then that one of the guards happened to look up at the building where Sarah had taken her shot. Even at that distance, she could see him pointing excitedly at the blackbird symbol painted on the wall, shouting something to his companions. Whatever he was saying caused immediate panic among the other guards, who began retreating back into their buildings with obvious fear. Sarah watched this reaction with professional curiosity, wondering what significance the symbol held for these particular enemies. She had no way of knowing that local legend held that the black Talon was a symbol of death, that seeing it meant you were already marked for elimination by forces beyond human understanding. What she also didn't know was that news of the impossible shot would spread quickly through intelligence networks, carrying with it the story of the mysterious sniper who had appeared like a ghost, eliminated one of the world's most wanted terrorists, and vanished again without a trace. The symbol on the building would become part of the legend, and soon military personnel would begin referring to the unknown marksman as Black Talon. The extraction took 4 days, moving carefully through territory that was now actively being searched by every enemy force in the region. Sarah moved like smoke through the ruins, using skills that had been honed by months of combat operations and a lifetime of learning to be invisible. When she finally reached the extraction point, she was met by Colonel Harrison himself, who had flown in to personally debrief the mission. His first words to her were simple: "The target is confirmed eliminated. The mission is a complete success." But it was his second statement that surprised her. "Sergeant Martinez, I need you to know that this mission is already becoming legendary among people who know about such things. The shot you made was considered impossible by every expert who analyzed it." Sarah simply nodded, accepting the praise with the same calm detachment she brought to everything else. "I did what needed to be done, sir." Harrison studied her face, seeing something that both impressed and concerned him. "There's something else you should know. Intelligence reports from the area indicate that enemy forces are now referring to you by a specific designation. They're calling you Black Talon, apparently in reference to the symbol on that building." He paused, then continued. "I've been authorized to tell you that this designation has been adopted by certain elements of our own military. When people need to refer to your missions in classified communications, they'll use that call sign." Sarah considered this information without any visible reaction. She had become accustomed to the idea that her reputation was growing beyond her control, but the idea of having a legendary designation felt surreal. "There's one more thing," Harrison said, producing a set of orders from his briefcase. "You're being promoted to staff sergeant, and you're being assigned to a new unit that doesn't officially exist. The missions will be even more sensitive than what you've been doing, and the targets will be even more dangerous." He handed her the orders, then stepped back slightly. "Congratulations, Staff Sergeant. You've earned something that very few people ever achieve. You've become a legend." As Sarah read through her new assignment orders that night, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. The girl who had been laughed at in that recruitment office now carried a reputation that made enemy forces flee in terror and earned whispered recognition from the highest levels of military command. But, more than the reputation or the recognition, what struck her was how completely she had transformed. The shy teenager from East Los Angeles had become something that even she sometimes didn't fully recognize. She had learned to kill with mechanical precision, to disappear into hostile territory for weeks at a time, and to make decisions that affected the balance of global security. The transformation was complete. Sarah Martinez had become Black Talon, and, when that name was whispered in classified briefing rooms or enemy safe houses, people understood that they were talking about something more than just another military operator. They were talking about death itself, precise and inevitable, delivered by someone who had learned to be more ghost than human. Years later, when a general would see that symbol and whisper Black Talon in recognition, he would be acknowledging not just a successful mission, but the emergence of something truly extraordinary. A person who had started with nothing except determination and had become one of the most dangerous individuals in the modern world. The girl they had laughed at was gone forever, replaced by someone whose very existence would change the calculus of warfare for enemies around the globe. The Black Talon had arrived, and the world would never be quite the same.